Alrighty. Oh, good evening, everyone. Very warm welcome to Green College. My name is Nico, and I'm one of the resident members here, and have the privilege of being one of the co-hosts for the resident member series alongside Aaron. Before we begin, we want to situate ourselves and acknowledge that we're here on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territory of Muslim people. This place has always been a place of learning far beyond the college's establishment. For those who are new, very warm welcome to you, your first time or your 100th time. The Resident Member Series is an opportunity for residents to present on their research in a really welcoming and warm and friendly environment. And whilst it may be getting chillier outside, the heat is on, and we're really excited for the discussion tonight. Allow me to please introduce Kelly. Kelly is a PhD student in medical anthropology, and her talk is entitled Cultural Hallucinations, the Illusion of Psychedelic Renaissance. Following Kelly's presentation, we'll have time for Q&A, and so please do hold your questions till the end, and if you're online as well, feel free to type those in the chat, and we will attend to them shortly after. With that, please do welcome Kelly to the stage.
Thanks, Nico. Despite several requests, I don't have any free samples, but thank you for coming anyway. Yeah, my name's Kelly. I'm in the medical anthropology program here at UBC, and a lot of you might not know, anthropology is the study of cultures, and medical anthropology specifically looks at cultural conceptions of things like disease, healing, health, and illness. And one of the things I really like about anthropology is the way that it understands culture as this ongoing and collective process of creating meaning. So it's something that's always changing, and it's something that we get to do together. And it's really interesting as an anthropologist when we see something, an aspect of culture that changes really quickly in real time. And we're seeing that with psychedelics right now. There's this huge push for legalization and specifically medicalization in this very narrow context. So it's been quite interesting as a researcher. But one of the things that I really appreciate about this dynamic understanding of culture is that, at least for me, it really allows us to have agency in that process, both individually and collectively. So if there's something that we don't like about culture, we can work together to change it. And of course, that's easier said than done, but it is possible. So the talk today is not exactly on my research, but it is on psychedelics more generally, and it's based on some questions that I often get about psychedelics. So my hope for the talk is that when you hear about psychedelics, either in the news or in conversation, you'll have a bit more of a framework in which to put that information, and hopefully you can assess the information in a more informed and hopefully critical way. Do I have to point this somewhere in particular?
No, you can just...
I'll use my laptop. So just a brief outline. I'm going to spend most of the time just talking about what psychedelics are and what this thing that is called the Psychedelic Renaissance is that we're supposedly in right now, along with some of the hype and promises that go along with the Psychedelic Renaissance. And then at the end, I just want to look at two things that I see as big social problems in our culture that I've kind of clumsily called decontextualization and extractivism. If you have suggestions of some synonyms for those, I'd appreciate it. And I just want to kind of turn the lens of psychedelics on those two social problems. And at the very end, I'll just give a quick hypothesis of why I think the psychedelic renaissance is happening now. And I know the usual format for the resident talks is that someone speaks and then you all ask questions at the end. But I do encourage you to please comment or ask questions throughout. I think that'll be more engaging and interesting for everyone. So first off, do we have any audience suggestions on either examples of specific psychedelics or even like a working definition of what psychedelics are. Any takers, Erin?
Something that makes you like trip.
Yeah. Okay, yeah.
Like are magic mushrooms part of psychedelics?
Magic mushrooms, yeah, yeah, for sure.
Mind-altering psychoactive compounds.
Yeah, yeah, that's right. Yeah, for sure.
It's a neologism coined because psychotomimetic, psychosis mimicking drug wasn't a good sell. Something like mind manifesting in Greek.
Yeah, that's very true. Psychotomimetic is if you're taking something that's supposed to induce psychoses, it's not very good branding. Sorry, what did you say?
Psilocybin?
Psilocybin? Yeah, yeah, for sure. It's an active ingredient in magic mushrooms. Yeah, yeah, those are great. It's much more engagement than the undergrad class when I asked that. So I'm not going to give you actually a very good definition. But the term psychedelics actually is a term of globalization. So if you think back a few hundred years or 1,000 years, a culture would be aware of a substance in their immediate environment that maybe produces some altered state, some non-ordinary mental state. But of course they wouldn't be aware of a culture halfway across the world that would have maybe a similar substance in their immediate environment. So it's not until we have globalization we can kind of take this bird's eye view that we see there's all these cultures all over the world that have similar substances that they have these relationships with, but they're all slightly different. And we've kind of put those under this blanket umbrella term of psychedelics. So there isn't really a clear consensus on what psychedelics are, a very good definition. Like you said, as some people say, psychedelics create non-ordinary mental states and some sort of expansion of consciousness. I have a few issues with this definition. Non-ordinary mental states is kind of vague. It's very relative, very subjective, and we don't know what consciousness is, so it doesn't really tell us exactly what is expanding. The term psychedelic, she said, actually means mind manifesting, and it was coined in 1957 by a guy named Humphrey Osmond. He was a psychiatrist working in Weyburn, Saskatchewan, of all places. So the term psychedelic is a Canadian term. And there have been other words like psychotomimetic that have been used over the years either as direct synonyms for psychedelics or terms that mean like a subcategory of psychedelics. So psychotomimetic is psychosis-inducing or psychosis mimicking. An entactogen is a substance that allows you to connect with the divine within. Hallucinogen is pretty straightforward, makes you hallucinate. And then an empathogen is a substance that increases your empathy, so either towards other people or towards yourself. And there's also no consensus on exactly which substances are psychedelics. I think this is partially due to the war on drugs, where we had decades of kind of this blanket prohibition against anything that's considered a drug. And so during that time, we really lost a lot of the nuances between different substances. But there is this important distinction between what are called classical psychedelics and what you might colloquially refer to as psychedelics that you might just hear on the street. And that's an important distinction that I'll get to later. Scientists also don't fully understand how psychedelics work, so how they actually create change in a person. There's debate whether it's the physiological effects, so the actual like neurochemical changes, the rewiring in the brain, if that's what's making the change, or if it's actually primarily the experience that you have, and if that experience is what's driving the change, or of course some combination of both. And importantly, psychedelic experiences are highly variable. So two people could take magic mushrooms at the same time, same environment, same setting, and have vastly different experiences. Or you could take LSD today, and then 2 weeks from now, and again have very, very different experiences. So I want to start with this category that we call classical psychedelics. So when you think of psychedelics, this is usually what people think of. Chemically, for maybe biochem nerds, they are 5-HT2A serotonin agonists or partial agonists. And they have very low toxicity, and we haven't really discovered a physical overdose threshold with them. Albert Hofmann, the guy who synthesized LSD, kind of by mistake, he took the first dose of LSD, he actually took 10 times what we would now consider a normal dose. And he didn't have a good time, but he was physically, he was okay. So there's no physical addiction with psychedelics the same way that you have either with like caffeine, nicotine, alcohol, opioids, of course. But there is a potential, like anything, for behavioral addiction. And there's also no physical withdrawal symptoms, although coming down from a trip can be emotionally uncomfortable sometimes, just coming back to reality. So some examples of what we refer to as classical psychedelics. We have psilocybin mushrooms in the top left. LSD underneath is just on water paper. Ayahuasca is in the top middle. It's made combining a vine and some leaves from the bush in the Amazon, among other things. And then the two on the right, San Pedro cactus and the peyote cactus, both contain mescaline as their active psychoactive compound. So in contrast with the classical psychedelics, you'll hear a lot of people refer to other substances as psychedelics that do not fit into that classical psychedelic category. So this is an incomplete list. You have some drugs on the left and then some fairly subjective categories on the right. The three that I suggest you maybe keep in mind or look out for, we have MDMA, which is also referred to as ecstasy. Again, that's an empathogen. Most people would call it an empathogen rather than a psychedelic. Ibogaine comes from the tree bark of the iboga plant in West Africa. And ketamine, you've also maybe heard of. It's legal, and it's a dissociative anesthetic that's used in surgeries. So those three are, there's a lot of clinical research happening with those three, and people will often refer to them as psychedelics, especially in the news. So again, with this umbrella term of psychedelics, it's just important to keep in mind that there's huge variety in those substances. So they come from very different sources, whether that's plants, animals, or increasingly synthesized in a lab. Very different cultural histories over time and space, which anthropology has a ton of great ethnographic data, if that's something you're interested in. The experiential and physiological effects are very different. Legal status also varies considerably. The ingestion method can be very different, so whether that's just eating something, making a tea, smoking, snorting, injecting, kind of whatever method you want, you can find something. The length of the trip also varies considerably, so everything from a couple minutes up to hours. Substances like ayahuasca or ibogaine cultures will often do kind of re-uppings. So you'll take an initial dose, and then as it starts to wear off, you'll take more and more and more, so you can end up having multi-day experiences. And then we'll talk about the clinical trials in a little bit, but there are various medical indications that people think different psychedelics are good for. But if you remember one thing from this talk, the things that I said about the classical psychedelics of being non-addictive, no potential for overdose, that does not apply to some of the colloquial psychedelics. So there is a possibility of overdose, addiction, and withdrawal with a lot of those substances. So especially if you are offered some psychedelics, please keep that in mind. So despite all that variety, there are some common features with psychedelics. So they're generally very communal. You don't usually see people in most cultures taking psychedelics by themselves. It's very communal both in the act of having the psychedelics, but also in this cultural meaning of where these psychedelics come from, what it means to interact with those substances, and creating meaning of the experiences themselves. There's usually some sort of authority figure associated with psychedelics, so whether that's like a shaman, curandera, or in our culture, we're shaping psychiatrists to be those points of authority. And ceremony is very important with psychedelics. That's a common feature in basically all cultures. You might have heard of the term set and setting. It was very popular in the 50s and 60s. Set refers to your mindset going into a trip, and then the setting refers to your environmental setting. That can be who you're with, where you are, what you're doing. And people try to use that to make sure they have a good set and setting to help mitigate any negative experiences. I won't go through all of this because, again, psychedelic experiences vary considerably. You can hallucinate on a lot of them, especially the classical psychedelics, but it's not guaranteed for all substances. A couple things that I find really interesting, this boundary disillusion can happen for some people, where the boundary between you and your perception of the world or your perception of other people can start to break down, which, if you think of someone who's maybe feels very isolated and very separate from people, that could be very healing to help you feel more connected to the world around you. But the inverse of that is that it could also be very destabilizing if you don't know where you end and where the rest of the world starts. A second thing I want to point out is that unlike a lot of other substances, like alcohol, if you think of when you're drunk, you don't really get this perception that the world is more real, but you do get that often with psychedelics, that you have this increased sense of reality. So you're not just numbed out to the world that you would have with alcohol or opioids. A lot of people actually feel that what they experience on psychedelics is somehow more true and more profound than everyday life. So just to wrap up this section, when you hear the term psychedelic, either in the news or in conversation, just let that be a trigger for you that it could be referring to a lot of different things, different sources, different experiences, and the way that people use the term psychedelics can mean very different things. Do you have any questions on that so far? Nope.
Actually,
Yeah.
you said that set and setting is a term that's was used more in the 50s, 60s. Would you say that's still like a good indicator about when you should or how you should enter these sort of like trips, I guess?
Yeah, it was definitely, I think, more popular, like with Timothy Leary in the 50s and 60s. People still use it and refer to it quite a bit, like in the psychedelic community. I think because psychedelics are so unpredictable, people want as much as possible to help control for bad experiences. So people still use that as a way to like try and have the best experience possible, but it definitely doesn't guarantee that you'll have a good time. Yeah.
So you talked about this boundary disillusion.
Mm-hmm.
So once you, let's say, if this person is feeling only disconnected from the world, and that they experience more connection while they're on the trip, and they come back to reality. How does that influence this person afterwards? Is it like, can they kind of people toward this thing that they felt, or can they kind of like feel more isolated, like given that they already experienced what could have been nice?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a good question. I think it would vary a lot depending on the person. Like I said, coming down from a trip can be very difficult, especially if you've had this like incredibly profound, beautiful experience, and then you come back to this that maybe you don't like very much, and you're still kind of back in the context that was troubling for you. So it's not that you'll necessarily have a sustained effect. But kind of I think the flip side of that, I think because you often have this increased sense of reality, I think that's part of what helps drive people to have more sustained impacts, that, you know, it's harder for people to just blame it on the drug, that experience. You know, it feels more real. But I do think it would really depend on
Use kind of like a psychiatrist or shaman, do they kind of navigate that part as well?
Yeah, I will talk about that. But yeah, that is part of the model that people are moving towards right now in the clinical trials. Yeah. Yeah.
Just a really quick question about, you talk about people having negative experiences sometimes and bad experiences, or what we might colloquially term as a bad trip.
Yeah.
But in what proportion of cases, in retrospect, do people see their bad trips as actually a positive or growth experience, and how does that play into that narrative?
Yeah. I don't know, statistically, that would be interesting. They might have, with the clinical trials, they might be tracking stuff like that. I've heard the expression that there's no bad trips, it's just bad interpretations. Yeah, I think people maybe have mixed feelings about that. You could have very terrifying traumatic experiences with psychedelics, and yes, maybe it's just perspective. Yes, maybe it's actually horrible. But yeah, I don't know. I think maybe with the talk therapy and psychiatry that's coming into psychedelics more, that's, I think, a way to help mitigate some of those bad trips or negative experiences, or at least try to, like you said, transform them into something more positive.
Yeah, I think I've just heard some people say, oh, I had a really bad experience, but I learned a lot about myself, or I faced a fear that bubbled up to the surface from my subconscious or whatever.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting. Anyway.
Yeah, no, it's true. I hear people say that a lot with ayahuasca, where you can have terrifying experiences, but it's the best thing they've ever I think the time scale for these things is also very different. I think we expect very quick results, but it might take you years or decades to integrate a bad trip. So at what point does it stop being bad and start being good? So yeah, that's the question. Okay, so on to the Psychedelic Renaissance. You might have heard this term before. It's kind of the era that people say we're in now. So if we look at the history of psychedelics in the West, the first wave was kind of in the 50s and 60s, very much associated with the counterculture. There were clinical trials going on at this time. Also a lot of covert research with the government. And then kind of the backlash to that, we had the war on drugs, which started in the 70s, is technically still going, and just this global prohibition against drugs. Clinical research was quite rare, but of course drug use continued. And then very quietly starting in the early 2000s, but really ramping up the last 5-10 years, we're in what people call the Psychedelic Renaissance. And we're seeing this huge resurgence of clinical trial research. There's a big focus on neurochemical changes, and psychedelics have really been picked up by the tech culture and a lot of celebrity endorsements, and there's this big self-optimization narrative that's going along with psychedelics now. But I want to focus specifically on the clinical trials because we're seeing this huge cultural shift in how we want to relate to psychedelics. We're doing that through clinical trials. We're using them as a tool to transition psychedelics conceptually from these dangerous illegal substances into what we consider something valid and a legal medicine. So if you look at a clinical trial, they're highly ritualized, and they're the way that we validate any sort of biomedical intervention, whether that's pharmaceuticals, diet, exercise, and there are hundreds of trials going on right now. It's not just happening in North America. Mostly for mental health conditions, but there's research going on for things like Parkinson's disease and cluster headaches. And if you think about what it takes for one drug to get to market, say like an insulin drug, going through all of the stages of a clinical trial and then actually getting onto the shelves, that's, you know, maybe decades and millions of dollars. But with psychedelic research, we're not just looking at one drug for one condition. We have dozens of substances and even more medical conditions that were being tested. So you actually end up with this huge network of research that is just kind of slowly being chipped away at. So I've listed some common pairings that you'll see in these clinical trials. The one that is probably furthest along is actually MDMA for post-traumatic stress disorder. Again, MDMA is not a classical psychedelic, but if you look at news articles, they'll often refer to MDMA research or ketamine research. Again, MDMA, which is also called ecstasy, is an empathogen, which, as you could think, would be very healing for someone who's had traumatic experiences. Again, when we look at clinical trials, they really aim for standardized, predictable, and replicable results, which you can imagine is kind of challenging with psychedelics. One of the ways that scientists try to mitigate some of those challenges is through isolating what we think are the active chemicals in order to standardize the doses. So if you think about just like chewing a handful of mushrooms, you don't really know how much psilocybin you're ingesting because it's going to vary significantly for each mushroom. And that's not good for a clinical trial when they're trying to standardize doses for people. So what you're getting now are things like pharmawaska instead of ayahuasca, isolating the DMT and some of the active molecules. 5-MeO-DMT is the active compound in toad venom, which is usually smoked. And then synthetic psilocybin instead of whole mushrooms. And although a lot of these substances occur naturally in nature, you would think you wouldn't be able to patent them. But because you have a lot of these synthetic compounds and these like tiny little chemical variations in them, there's actually thousands of molecular and delivery method patents that have been filed in the last couple decades. And this has kind of been brought up already, but we could go about introducing psychedelics into our culture in a lot of different ways, but the way that we're choosing to do this is through a model called psychedelic assisted therapy. And that's where you have kind of traditional talk therapy with your therapist, just while you have psychedelics. So this usually is quite a long process. You would have these preparation sessions beforehand, sober, just like a normal therapy session where you would talk about your problems and what your intentions are. And then you would have either one or multiple active dosing sessions. So this is where you actually take the psychedelic and then you're there with your therapist. If you're capable, you're able to talk about them while problems come up during a trip. And then after that, you would have these sober integration sessions. So again, trying to make sense of what came up in your trip. If anything was challenging, you're making sense of them and trying to integrate them into your life. And the legislation that's either been passed or drafted has positioned psychiatrists specifically kind of as the gatekeepers to this process. So if psychedelics do get legalized, it probably won't be the way that cannabis has been legalized in Canada. If psychedelics are legalized, it will very likely be under this model. So you would probably need like a prescription from a psychiatrist and then have to go through this long process of talk therapy. This is just a photo of a psychedelic therapy session. It's quite a bland room, I think, but sorry, you had a question? Yeah.
So, sorry, I was just wondering on that last part, when I'm at Rec Beach, for example, there's people coming up to me asking if I want to buy shrooms.
Yeah.
Or I see these, some stores in kits as well that have that are selling mushrooms,
Yeah.
and maybe under the guise that they don't really do anything, but they do have some sort of psychedelic properties. So how is that legislation, like how is that legal? Or like,
That's a really good question. No, not really. I'm not like a policy legal expert, so don't quote me on this, but BC has a decriminalization policy right now, so possession of drugs is not policed here. And we kind of saw this with cannabis too, like before it was legalized, there were a ton of shops that popped up because they wanted to get in on the market before it was actually legal. And the cops just kind of had bigger fish to fry. The shops here, as far as I know, they're not legal. Like, they're legal businesses, but what they're selling is not legal, as far as I know. Not really legal to buy from them. But again, it's maybe safer than buying off the street, possibly. Yeah, it's a good question though.
Just in terms of legality,
Yeah.
Health Canada has issued several religious exemptions for several subs, not just Christian religion, but there's one for some bizarre DMT cult. So I would just put it to you that medicalization is one route, but that route, which has to exist in Canada probably so the minister can do risk management on a court judgment that the whole section is unconstitutional. If you put the right tokens into the arcade machine, an exemption should come out in theory, because it's supposed to be an administrative law process. So that's another avenue.
Yeah, no, that's a really good point. There's so many ways we can come at this. There's a company called MAPS. It's a nonprofit you may have heard of. When the war on drugs hit, MAPS has kind of been the biggest collective that's been pushing for legalization. And they've decided to go about it through clinical trials, but you're totally right. There are many other ways to come at it. Religious exemption is one of them. I think peyote is legal in Canada.
Peyote was never scheduled in Canada.
Okay, well, there you go.
It's exempted specifically in the sea. So eat all the peyote you want, kids. You can even eat it. Necessarily made admissible to the United States. Inadmissible, pardon me.
Yeah, you just got to get it up here.
Yeah, don't do it there. It's illegal.
Yeah. No, that's very true. I think it'll, like, if psychedelics are legalized under this, like, psychedelic assisted therapy model, it will be very difficult, I think, for businesses and maybe interesting for other groups who do have exemptions to try and navigate the red tape around all of that. Just to go back to the picture, the psychedelic assisted therapy model usually has two therapists right now, a male and a female, and the person who's taking the psychedelic usually has a blindfold, maybe listening to some music. Depending on the dose, they may or may not be able to really communicate what they're going through. And again, if you think about the length of trips, some of them can be very short. Something like psilocybin could be 6 hours. LSD is longer than that. So having someone babysit you for that long, plus all the talk therapy before and after, it does make for a very long process. I find the mix of religious iconography interesting, the Buddha and the mushroom statue in the back. So there is a lot of hype that goes along with the Psychedelic Renaissance. I think a lot of this is like a backlash to the war on drugs, where they were demonized for so long, but people still really felt that they could make this huge change in the world. And so there's a lot of evangelism around psychedelics. They're primarily branded as this big revolution in mental health treatments, but there is quite a bleed over into other areas. A lot of people think that if only everyone could take psychedelics, we'd have this like expansion in global consciousness. It would be a cure for climate change, we have world peace, net zero trauma. Of course, not everyone believes that. I think that is a minority, but you do see that narrative popping up a lot. And I really see it as this like sense of utopianism, but specifically through self-optimization. So it's through healing the individuals that you'll get this collective change. These are just some headings. So again, when you come across news articles that are looking at psychedelics, you can kind of branch them into, I've put them into 3 different groups. So this first one is focusing on individual healing, so this idea of rewiring a brain, chemical focus, self-optimization. It's really focused on the individual and treating the individual's problems. Second, and I think this is probably the most common, is a focus on an industry revolution, specifically for psychiatry, and the way that it'll change the market and the industry and the way that we actually approach mental health in general. And then lastly, and probably least commonly, this idea of that we can save the world through psychedelics. Oh, so MAPS, this is the company or the nonprofit I mentioned earlier. This guy is Rick Doblin, who founded MAPS. And I just find this picture interesting. He really does think we can have a world of net zero trauma by 2070.
Going with the Christ-like figure.
I know, the full white suit. So things are changing. I remember when I was a kid, psychedelics were the scariest thing I could think of. I heard that they would melt your brain, they got stored in your spinal cord, and they would come out and give you flashbacks. And as I got older, I heard more and more stories of people who had taken psychedelics and they thought they were like the best thing in the world. They were really healed by psychedelics. And so I got really excited because I think as you get older, you see more and more problems of the world. And, we want something that can help with that. So I did what anyone would do and decided to do a PhD looking at psychedelics. And I really wanted to look at how psychedelics are actually different from other substances. And I wonder why these changes are happening now. So, at the risk of creating a straw man argument, I do want to look at 2 things that I see as really deep fundamental problems in our culture. And then compare those to this new model of psychedelics that we have. So the first thing I'm calling decontextualization. And this is when we take something that you would consider as a whole thing and kind of break it down into its component parts. And this is not at all a negative thing. It's very functional for detailed, in-depth learning. But when that's done without reintegrating back into the whole, you're left with these kind of disjointed component parts, and you kind of ignore the broader context in which those parts exist. You lose the relationship between the parts and the whole. So if we look at that socially, we get this culture of hyper-individualism, a cult of the self, and this idea of self-optimization, that we need to improve ourselves and make ourselves better. Medically, I think this is a big criticism of the Western medical system. We tend to treat individual symptoms and isolated problems rather than the whole person, or really understanding the causes of those problems. And we also treat things with isolated compounds rather than whole foods or medicines, which in itself might not be a bad thing, arguably could be okay. The second problem is extractivism, and you hear this word thrown around a lot, specifically in relation to the environment and the destruction that we cause. But I really understand extractivism as relating to things as resources that are there for us to use. And so yes, we see this with the environment, but I also see that in the way that we relate to each other and even the way that we understand ourselves, increasingly as something to be marketed and something that is there to be exploited and to be used. It's a very human-centric perspective, that everything is there for us. It's very self-centric. When we look at that in a medical context, we can see medicines being patented, even the term intellectual property, that medicine, the creation of medicine is the result of one company or one person's work, which I would disagree with. And then the idea that once you have a patent on something, you have rights to decide how it's used and what it's used for. We also see this in limited access to medicines, or if there isn't sufficient profits. So when something's in market, of course it's going to have a price. A lot of people can't afford the price of medications, even with insurance. But maybe in a more subtle context, we also see that in companies refusing to even develop medications in the first place if there aren't enough people to make it worthwhile. So that was just very brief, not an exhaustive list of what I think are the problems in our culture. But if we take those two things and look at how we're shaping psychedelics, you might guess I don't think it's actually very good. So if we look at decontextualization, the way that we're shaping psychedelics, I think, still places all of the responsibility of change on the individual. So we don't have that relationship between the individual parts and the collective, and how those things need to change in tandem. It really ignores the larger context in which people live. Why do we have a mental health crisis? What is a mental health crisis? This idea of individuals having an individual mental health problem, needing to fix it on their own in order to get back to work, that still places a lot of responsibility solely on the individual. And again, we're isolating what we think are the active compounds in psychedelics. And again, I don't think this is necessarily a bad thing. I think we just don't understand how psychedelics work well enough in order to be taking out one part of something. Moving on to extractivism, I really just see this as not having any relationship of mutuality between humans and these substances that we call psychedelics. We're still seeing psychedelics as tools, something that is there to be used. Even if you think of the language that we use for psychedelics, like, do you take psychedelics? Do you consume psychedelics? These are very extractivist terms. And I even struggle to use different language, how you relate to psychedelics maybe, but even that doesn't really kind of get the same point across. And then, as I mentioned, these psychedelics are being patented, which I think will have negative consequences down the line. Makes sense in the model that we have, the business model, but I think there are negative consequences to that. So, well.
Just touch a little bit on extractivism and how that kind of impacts, I think, like indigenous communities around the world. So there's this sense, well, a lot of indigenous communities have medicine that is psychedelic, but it goes beyond that to other things like antibiotic clay, for instance, right? And there's a lot, because indigenous knowledge is held as collective, it's not seen as being immediately compatible with intellectual property laws within Canada, so that, and you know, like a lot of indigenous communities see ourselves as having a relationship with these different psychedelics or plant medicines, and we, you know, essentially want to protect them. But what happens is that the laws tend, like the intellectual property laws tend to work against us, and thus these sort of things become exposed to the whole world.
Yeah, thank you for that. I see that as like a fundamental incompatibility in the way that our culture relates to things versus other cultures.
Yeah, so I think it's like a large ethical concern, really.
Yeah, and when this is the dominant culture, it doesn't recognize, especially in a legal context, other ways of knowing and relating to things. Yeah, I think.
If I could just add something on extractivism, it seems to me really unlikely that these substances will be sponsored through clinical trials by the biomedical industry because they don't really fit their model. I'm thinking of the anthropologist Joe Dumit's book, Drugs for Life. And what the industry loves are drugs that people have to take every day for the rest of their lives, like statins, diabetes medicine, and so on, because that's where the profit is. Even marijuana fits there because people develop a habit, so it's great to have marijuana stores. But if you take acid, twice a year to check in with yourself or just when you're dying, there's no profit to be made there, right?
Yeah, I think that's maybe a contradiction within the psychedelic narrative, that it can magically fix you, but then it also needs to fit into this capitalist model that we have. What was that?
Oh,
He wants to add opiates.
Yeah, add opiates to LSD tabs to get us hooked to them.
Yeah, I think to compensate for that, as I'll mention in a second, there's other ways of monetizing. There's other reasons for this change that we're seeing now. It's not just the traditional pharmaceutical model that we've seen in the past.
Well, just to build on that, there's like this micro dosage of mushrooms. So I think there's ways of thinking in like within the same model of using those. And I've seen that those are like a trend like right now, like those micro doses, and people they use it for different things, depression or anxiety or whatever. There's like different 1,000 things that they are supposed to help with. So I don't know, I just wanted to throw it out there to, like, there's already examples of maybe like having some profit with these things that we are not supposed. Well, I don't know if we are supposed or not, but I'm going to keep it there.
Yeah, no, that does tie in well. Microdosing's interesting because it's taking a very low dose of something that's not psychoactive, so supposedly not perceptible. And so what I mentioned at the beginning, this argument of whether it's like a neurochemical change versus an experiential change, you don't really get the experience with microdosing, so it is really leaning heavily into that neurochemical change, which is more like a traditional pharmaceutical, something that maybe you would take 3 days a week, indefinitely, rather than these like big heroic doses of psychedelics. Yeah. So that leads nicely into why I think this is all happening now. I think that the psychedelic industry is booming now because it's not fundamentally changing anything in our culture. On the inverse of that, I actually think that the way we are shaping psychedelics now is actually reinforcing a lot of the negative aspects of our culture. So whether that's other ways of monetizing them, the decontextualization and extractivism that I talked about. I think it's easy to think that psychedelics are making this big change, but in my opinion, I think it's more of the same with different window dressing. But it's not so bad. It's not great, but it's not so bad. This doesn't mean, first, that psychedelics don't help people. There are hundreds and thousands of people whose lives have been saved and transformed with psychedelics. They can do a lot of good for people. Of course, they've also done a lot of harm for people. But just because I don't think they're necessarily making the big changes that are being promised right now, that doesn't mean I don't think that they can help people. And second, even though when I started to realize this, it was quite disheartening for me because I do want change and I do want things to be better. But I think it's very, very important for us to see when something is not working the way that we think it is. I think especially in academia, we have a responsibility to really question what we're doing. You know, we all want our work to be meaningful. We all want to make a difference. And I think a lot of the time, our work is either not really making a difference or it's reinforcing the things that we want to change. And so, for me, realizing that psychedelics aren't really doing what I want them to do, it's good because I think I can look for other ways of